Flight attendant hit black pregnant woman, husband was airline CEO. You need to leave this first-class cabin immediately. You clearly don't belong here. Actually, I do belong here, and I have the boarding pass to prove it. Margaret Wilson stood her ground in the narrow aisle of Flight 372, one hand protectively cradling her 7-month pregnant belly, the other clutching her boarding pass. The flight attendant, her name tag read Diane, looked down at Margaret with unconcealed disdain, her lips pressed into a tight line. "I've already checked your boarding pass once, ma'am, and there must be some mistake," Diane said, her voice rising just enough to draw the attention of nearby passengers. "This section is for our premium customers only." Margaret took a deep breath, her shoulders squared despite her exhaustion. "There's no mistake. I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." The tension in the cabin was thick enough to cut with a knife as other passengers began to stare. An elderly white couple exchanged uncomfortable glances. A businessman pretended to be absorbed in his newspaper. "Look," Diane hissed, lowering her voice and leaning closer to Margaret, "I don't want to make a scene, but I'm going to have to ask you to move back to economy where you belong. We have executives and important people in this section." Margaret's eyes flashed. "And what exactly makes you think I don't qualify as important people?" Before Diane could respond, Margaret felt a sharp twinge in her abdomen, a pain so sudden and severe that she gasped and doubled over, grabbing the nearest seat for support. "Oh my God," a passenger murmured. "Is she having the baby?" someone else asked. Diane's expression shifted from contempt to alarm. "Ma'am, please," but Margaret couldn't hear her anymore. The cabin seemed to spin as another wave of pain washed over her. Just as her knees began to buckle, strong hands caught her from behind. "What's going on here?" a deep, authoritative voice demanded. Margaret looked up into the face of her husband, James Wilson, his normally composed features now twisted with concern and fury. "Sir, this woman was," Diane began. "This woman," James cut in, his voice dangerously quiet, "is my wife. And I'd like to know why she's being harassed while I was in the restroom." The blood drained from Diane's face as recognition dawned. "Mr. Wilson, I had no idea that she's married to the CEO of this airline," James finished for her. "Or that she's pregnant and in distress while you're busy profiling her." The entire first-class cabin had gone deadly silent. But let's go back to how this all started. It was just 3 hours earlier when Margaret and James Wilson were preparing for what should have been a routine flight home. Morning sunlight streamed through the wide windows of the Wilsons' elegant brownstone in Boston's Beacon Hill neighborhood. Margaret sat at the kitchen island, sipping her caffeine-free tea and reviewing her notes for the foundation meeting she would attend in Chicago the next day. At 42, Margaret Wilson was finally expecting her first child after years of trying. A respected pediatric surgeon with deep roots in Chicago's South Side community, she had met James Wilson 15 years ago when he was just a mid-level executive visiting her hospital to discuss a corporate donation. "Are you sure you're up for this trip?" James asked as he entered the kitchen, already dressed in his impeccable charcoal suit. At 55, James Wilson carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who had worked his way up from humble beginnings. The son of a Pullman porter, he had put himself through college selling encyclopedias door-to-door in the 1980s before climbing the corporate ladder to become one of the few black CEOs of a major airline. Margaret looked up and smiled at her husband. "The doctor said I'm clear to fly until week 35. I'm only at 28 weeks, and this children's hospital fundraiser has been on my calendar for months." She placed a protective hand on her rounded belly. "Besides, I want our daughter to know her mother never stops fighting for what matters." James came around the island and placed a gentle kiss on Margaret's forehead. "That's one of the many reasons I fell in love with you, your determination." Margaret checked her watch, a vintage Bulova that had belonged to her grandmother, who had been one of the first black nurses at Chicago's Provident Hospital. "We should head out soon if we want to beat the traffic to Logan." James nodded, picking up both their suitcases. "Ted's waiting with the car downstairs. I've arranged for us to use the premium lounge so you can rest before boarding." The drive to Logan International Airport was smooth, with James occasionally checking his emails while Margaret gazed out the window, watching Boston's historic buildings give way to more modern structures as they approached the airport. "Any issues I should know about before we board one of your planes?" Margaret teased, nudging her husband with her elbow. James chuckled, his deep laugh lines crinkling around his eyes. "Just the usual corporate headaches. We're rolling out a new diversity training program for all staff next month. Some of the old-timers are grumbling about it." "Change never comes easy," Margaret said, thinking back to her own battles for equality in the medical field. "But it's necessary." When they arrived at the airport, Ted, their driver of many years, insisted on handling their luggage. "Mrs. Wilson, you just take care of yourself and that precious cargo," he said with a grandfatherly smile, patting her shoulder. Inside the terminal, James guided Margaret through the VIP security lane, where they were processed quickly and efficiently. As they walked toward the premium lounge, Margaret noticed James being recognized by several airline employees who nodded respectfully or stopped to say hello. "Mr. Wilson, sir," a young ground crew member said, approaching them with a tablet in hand. "Just wanted to let you know the new fuel efficiency numbers came in and they're looking good." "Thanks, Kevin," James replied warmly. "We'll discuss it when I'm back on Wednesday." Margaret smiled as they continued walking. 15 years and I'm still getting used to being married to a big shot," says the woman who literally holds children's hearts in her hands, James countered with a proud smile. In the premium lounge, they found a quiet corner where Margaret could put her feet up. James went to get her some water and fruit, leaving his phone on the table. It buzzed with an incoming call from Diane Mercer, senior cabin staff. "James," Margaret called when he returned, "someone named Diane is calling you." James glanced at the phone and sighed. "Diane Mercer, one of our longest-serving flight attendants. She's been with the airline since the Pan AM days. Should you take it?" "No, she can leave a message. She's actually going to be on our flight today, probably just checking if I need anything special." The lounge was peaceful, with soft jazz playing in the background, a Miles Davis piece that reminded Margaret of her father's record collection. She watched as business travelers typed furiously on laptops, while others leafed through magazines or dozed in the comfortable chairs. An announcement over the PA system informed them that boarding for their flight to Chicago would begin in 20 minutes. "I need to use the restroom before we board," Margaret said, struggling slightly to rise from the deep lounge chair. James immediately offered his hand, helping her to her feet. "Take your time, I'll wait for you here," he said. When Margaret returned, she found James in an intense phone conversation, his brow furrowed. "Listen, Peterson, the board has already approved this initiative. The diversity training is happening, period," he said firmly before ending the call. "Trouble?" Margaret asked. James shook his head dismissively. "Just the old guard resisting progress, nothing new." He checked his watch, a vintage Omega Speedmaster that had been a gift from Margaret on their 10th anniversary. "We should head to the gate. They'll be boarding soon, and I want to make sure you're comfortable." As they approached the gate, Margaret noticed a group of flight attendants gathered for their pre-flight briefing. One older woman with perfectly coiffed blonde hair glanced their way, and her expression flickered with something Margaret couldn't quite identify, surprise, perhaps, or displeasure. "Is that Diane?" Margaret asked quietly. James followed her gaze and nodded. "Yes, that's her. Been with the airline over 30 years. Old school in many ways, but she knows the job inside and out." The boarding process began smoothly, with first-class passengers called first. James and Margaret stepped forward, presented their boarding passes, and were welcomed aboard by a smiling gate agent. As they made their way down the jet bridge, James said, "I need to speak with the captain briefly before we take off, just a quick check-in. Will you be okay getting settled?" "James, I'm pregnant, not helpless," Margaret reminded him with a smile. "Go to your CEO things, I'll be fine." They separated at the aircraft door, where James was greeted warmly by the co-pilot and escorted toward the cockpit. Margaret was left to find her seat in the first-class cabin, where Diane Mercer was checking boarding passes and directing passengers. When Margaret approached, extending her boarding pass, Diane barely glanced at it before gesturing vaguely toward the rear of the aircraft. "Economy boarding is not for another 15 minutes, ma'am." Margaret blinked in surprise. "I'm in first class." Seat 3A, Diane finally looked at Margaret properly, her gaze moving from Margaret's face to her pregnant belly, then to her simple but elegant maternity dress, as if assessing whether she belonged in the premium cabin. "May I see your boarding pass again?" Diane asked, her tone suggesting she expected to find a mistake. Margaret handed over the pass, which Diane examined with obvious skepticism. "This appears to be correct," Diane finally admitted, returning the document. "Seat 3A is the third row on the left." "Thank you," Margaret said, moving past her. As Margaret stored her small handbag and settled into her seat by the window, she noticed Diane watching her with a puzzled expression. The flight attendant soon approached with a tray of pre-flight beverages. "Water or juice?" Diane asked the businessman across the aisle, her voice warm and attentive. When she turned to Margaret, her tone cooled noticeably. "Something to drink." "Orange juice, please," Margaret replied, maintaining her composure. Diane set the juice on Margaret's tray table without a word and moved on to the next passenger, her customer service smile returning immediately. Margaret sipped her juice and gazed out the window, trying not to let the interaction bother her. Throughout her career, she had encountered similar treatment people who made assumptions based solely on her appearance, who couldn't reconcile her blackness with her position as a top surgeon. Usually, James's presence prevented the worst of it, but even after decades of professional success, these moments still stung. The cabin continued to fill as economy passengers filed past. Margaret noticed a few curious glances her way, but kept her attention on her medical journal, one hand resting protectively on her belly. James returned just as the final boarding call was announced. He slipped into the seat beside her and took her hand. "Everything all right? You look troubled." Margaret hesitated, then shook her head. "It's nothing, just tired. You sure you know you can tell me anything?" Before Margaret could respond, Diane appeared at their row, her professional smile frozen in place. "Mr. Wilson, sir, I didn't realize you'd be joining us today. Can I get you anything before takeoff?" James looked up, his expression neutral. "I'm fine for now, thank you, Diane." If Diane connected James with Margaret, she gave no indication. She simply nodded and continued her preparations for takeoff. "See," Margaret whispered once Diane had moved away. "Nothing worth mentioning." James squeezed her hand but looked unconvinced. After 15 years of marriage, he could read her too well. The flight taxied and took off without incident. Margaret dozed lightly as the plane reached cruising altitude, lulled by the steady hum of the engines. When she woke, James was no longer beside her. She pressed the call button and a young male flight attendant responded. "Yes, ma'am." "Do you know where my husband went?" Margaret asked. "The gentleman who was sitting here, I believe he went to the restroom," the young man replied politely. Margaret nodded her thanks and decided to use the restroom herself. As she unbuckled her seatbelt and stood, she felt a slight dizziness, not unusual in her condition, but uncomfortable nonetheless. She steadied herself on the seat back and made her way carefully toward the front of the cabin. That's when Diane stepped into her path, blocking the way to the first-class lavatories. "You need to leave this first-class cabin immediately. You clearly don't belong here." If you're enjoying this story, please consider subscribing to hear more stories like this. The confrontation in the aisle had escalated quickly, leading to the crisis point where we began. As James Wilson held his wife steady, the first-class cabin was completely silent, every passenger watching the drama unfold. "James," Margaret whispered, her face contorted with pain. "Something's wrong with the baby." Those words transformed the atmosphere instantly. James's anger at Diane gave way to fear for his wife and unborn child. "We need medical assistance," he called out, his authoritative voice carrying through the cabin. "Is there a doctor on board?" An elderly man 2 rows back stood up. "I'm Dr. Harold Freeman, retired obstetrician." "Thank God," James muttered, helping Margaret into the nearest seat. Dr. Freeman made his way forward, his movements deliberate but quick for a man in his 70s. His kind face was deeply lined, suggesting years of attending births and caring for mothers. "Let me take a look, young lady," he said gently to Margaret. Diane stood frozen, her face ashen. "Mr. Wilson, I had no idea." "Not now," James cut her off, his attention focused entirely on his wife. Dr. Freeman knelt beside Margaret's seat, speaking to her in low, reassuring tones. After a brief examination, he looked up at James. "She's not in labor," he announced, and both James and Margaret released audible sighs of relief. "But she's experiencing severe Braxton Hicks contractions, possibly triggered by stress and dehydration. She needs to lie down and rest immediately." James turned to Diane, who had remained rooted to the spot. "We'll need the row cleared for my wife to lie down." The shock on Diane's face had given way to a professional mask as she nodded quickly. "Of course, Mr. Wilson, right away." She turned to the passengers in the row behind. "Sir, ma'am, would you mind relocating to other first-class seats? We have a medical situation." The couple quickly gathered their belongings and moved, while Diane arranged the seats to create a makeshift bed for Margaret. Dr. Freeman supervised as James and the young male flight attendant, whose name tag read Michael, helped Margaret lie down. The doctor then checked her pulse and asked Michael to bring water and juice. "The baby's heartbeat is strong," Dr. Freeman assured Margaret after listening with a stethoscope provided from the plane's emergency kit. "These contractions should subside with rest and fluids." James hadn't let go of Margaret's hand throughout the examination. Now he looked up and scanned the cabin, his gaze finally landing on Diane, who was hovering uncertainly nearby. "Diane," he said, his voice low but clear. "A word, please, in the galley." Diane swallowed visibly but nodded and followed James to the front galley, out of earshot of the other passengers. Once they were alone, James faced her directly. I want to understand exactly what happened here. Diane's hands trembled slightly. Mr. Wilson, I had absolutely no idea she was your wife. She wasn't on the VIP list, and that's not what I'm asking, James interrupted. Even if she weren't my wife, even if she were any other passenger, what happened here was unacceptable. Diane's gaze dropped to the floor. I thought there had been a boarding pass error. We sometimes have economy passengers who try to sit in first class, and you assumed my wife was one of them, James finished for her. Why? The question hung in the air between them. Diane opened her mouth, then closed it, unable to provide an answer that wouldn't incriminate her further. James sighed heavily. I've known you for 20 years, Diane. You've been with this airline longer than I have. But what I witnessed today goes against everything we stand for, everything I've been trying to build. Sir, when we land in Chicago, James continued, you'll be placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation. I'll have HR contact you with the details. Diane's face crumpled. Mr. Wilson, please, I've given my life to this airline. I'm 5 years from retirement. And in those 5 years, James asked quietly, how many other passengers might you treat the way you treated my wife today? How many people have you already made feel unwelcome or unworthy because of how they look? Tears welled in Diane's eyes. It wasn't like that. It was exactly like that, James said firmly. And the worst part is, I don't think you even realize it. He turned to go back to Margaret, then paused. For now, I want you to stay in the galley. Michael can handle first class for the remainder of the flight. Diane nodded mutely, a single tear tracking down her carefully made-up face. When James returned to Margaret's side, Dr. Freeman gave him an encouraging nod. She's doing better. The contractions are less frequent. Margaret reached for James's hand. Is everything okay? James managed a reassuring smile. Everything's fine. I'm just worried about you and the baby. I'm sorry, Margaret said softly. I should have told you about her attitude earlier. James shook his head. No, I'm sorry. I should have been more aware. He gently brushed a strand of hair from her forehead. Just rest now. We'll be in Chicago in about an hour. As Margaret closed her eyes, James settled into the seat across the aisle where he could watch over her. Dr. Freeman stayed nearby, occasionally checking Margaret's pulse and asking about her discomfort level. Michael approached with a concerned expression. Mr. Wilson, the captain would like an update on Mrs. Wilson's condition. Should we divert to Detroit? We're about halfway between Boston and Chicago now. James looked to Dr. Freeman, who shook his head. I don't think that's necessary. Her vitals are stable and the contractions are subsiding. As long as she remains calm and resting, it's safer to continue to Chicago than to risk the stress of an emergency landing. Tell the captain we'll continue to Chicago, James instructed Michael, but have an ambulance standing by when we land. As Michael went to relay the message, the businessman who had been receipted approached James hesitantly. Mr. Wilson, I'm Robert Tanaka. I couldn't help overhearing. I want you to know that several of us witnessed what happened, and we'd be happy to provide statements if needed. James nodded gratefully. Thank you, Mr. Tanaka. That may be necessary. I fly with this airline every week, Robert continued, and I've never seen anything like what happened today. It was, he paused, searching for the right word, disappointing. Yes, James agreed quietly. It was. After Robert returned to his seat, James closed his eyes briefly, feeling the weight of what had occurred. He had built his career on breaking barriers, on proving that excellence knew no color. The airline's diversity initiatives had been his personal mission, championed against considerable resistance from old guard executives like Peterson. And yet here was Diane Mercer, one of his most senior employees, demonstrating exactly the kind of behavior his programs were designed to eliminate. The irony wasn't lost on him. A soft moan from Margaret brought him back to the present. Her eyes were open and she was watching him. I know that look, she said softly. You're carrying the world on your shoulders again. Despite everything, James smiled. Just thinking. About how this proves you were right all along, Margaret suggested. About the need for your training programs? Something like that, James admitted. Margaret adjusted herself slightly, grimacing. When I was doing my residency at Mass General in the 90s, there was an attending physician who always made me double-check my work but never asked the same of my white colleagues. One day, I confronted him about it. What happened? He was shocked, said he was just being thorough. He had no idea he was treating me differently. Margaret sighed. People like him, like Diane, they don't see their biases. They need someone to hold up a mirror. Before James could respond, the captain's voice came over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be beginning our descent into Chicago, Hare International Airport in approximately 15 minutes. At this time, we ask that all passengers return to their seats and fasten their seatbelts. Dr. Freeman checked Margaret one last time. The contractions have almost stopped. That's good news, but I still recommend you see your obstetrician as soon as possible after we land. Thank you, doctor, James said, shaking the older man's hand. We're very grateful for your help. Just doing what anyone would do, Dr. Freeman replied modestly. Besides, I delivered babies for 40 years. Old habits die hard. He patted Margaret's shoulder gently. You take care of yourself and that little one. As Dr. Freeman returned to his seat, Michael approached with a satellite phone. Mr. Wilson, Ms. Chen from the executive office is on the line. She heard about what happened and wanted to speak with you before we land. James took the phone. Victoria, yes, we're about to land. Margaret's stable now, thank God. No, I've placed Diane Mercer on administrative leave. Yes, I want a full investigation. Also, call Peterson and tell him this is exactly why the diversity training program needs to be fast-tracked. I'll call you from the hospital. He handed the phone back to Michael. Please make sure our luggage is expedited and have a wheelchair ready at the gate for my wife. Already arranged, sir, Michael assured him, and the ambulance will be waiting at the terminal. The plane began its descent into Chicago, the sprawling city visible through the windows as they broke through the cloud cover. Margaret had dozed off again, her breathing steady, one hand resting protectively over her belly. James watched her sleep, his mind racing with all that had happened and what was yet to come. The incident would undoubtedly have repercussions, for Diane, for the airline, for his diversity initiatives. But none of that mattered compared to Margaret and their unborn daughter. As the plane touched down at O'Hare with a gentle bump, James made a silent promise to both of them. No matter what it took, he would create a world where they were never made to feel like they didn't belong. 3 hours later, Margaret lay in a private room at Northwestern Memorial Hospital, connected to monitors that tracked both her vital signs and the baby's heartbeat. The steady beep-beep of their daughter's strong heartbeat was the most reassuring sound James had ever heard. Dr. Elaine Watkins, Margaret's high-risk pregnancy specialist, reviewed the results of the ultrasound and other tests. Everything looks good. The baby is healthy, and there's no sign of early labor. What you experienced were indeed severe Braxton Hicks contractions, likely triggered by stress and mild dehydration. Margaret squeezed James's hand in relief. However, Dr. Watkins continued, her expression serious, this was a warning sign. Your body is telling you to slow down. I'm recommending bed rest for the next week, and after that, significantly reduced activity until delivery. Margaret's face fell. But the fundraiser tomorrow can be handled by someone else, James interrupted gently. Nothing is more important than you and the baby. Dr. Watkins nodded in agreement. I know it's difficult, Margaret, especially for someone as active as you, but at 42 with a first pregnancy, we need to be cautious. After Dr. Watkins left, promising to check in again before discharging Margaret the next morning, James pulled a chair close to the bedside. Been thinking, he said, taking Margaret's hand. Maybe it's time I step back a bit too. Margaret looked surprised. What do you mean? I mean that I've been so focused on changing the airline, on proving myself, that I haven't been present enough for what really matters. James gestured to Margaret's belly. For who really matters? James Wilson, you stop that right now, Margaret said firmly. You've worked too hard to build what you have, and your work matters. Today proved that. James sighed. Today also proved that despite 15 years of my leadership, despite all the initiatives and training programs, we still have people like Diane Mercer making others feel unwelcome and unworthy. And if you step away, who will hold people like Diane accountable? Who will push for change? Margaret challenged. Our daughter needs a world where she's not judged by the color of her skin, and you're in a position to help create that world. Before James could respond, there was a soft knock at the door. To his surprise, Victoria Chen, his chief of staff, stood in the doorway. I hope I'm not intruding, Victoria said hesitantly. Victoria, come in, James invited, standing to greet her. I didn't expect to see you in person. Victoria, an efficient woman in her early 40s, entered the room carrying a large gift basket. I wanted to check on you both personally. How are you feeling, Dr. Wilson? Much better, thank you, Margaret replied with a smile. And please, it's Margaret. Victoria set the gift basket down and handed James a folder. The preliminary incident report from the flight. Michael and several passengers have already provided statements. James accepted the folder but didn't open it. That can wait until tomorrow. There's something else you should know, Victoria continued. The story is starting to circulate. A passenger posted about it on social media and it's gaining traction. The PR team is preparing a statement, but they need your approval. James sighed. The last thing we need is a public relations nightmare. Actually, Victoria said, it might not be as bad as you think. The passenger who posted was very clear about how quickly the situation was addressed and how well the airline responded to the medical emergency. They specifically praised your leadership and commitment to your wife's well-being. Margaret raised an eyebrow. That's a silver lining, I suppose. There's more, Victoria said, pulling out her tablet and bringing up an email. Since this afternoon, we've received dozens of messages from employees throughout the company, expressing their support for you both and their commitment to making the airline more inclusive. She handed the tablet to James, who scrolled through the messages with growing amazement. Flight attendants, gate agents, mechanics, pilots, employees from every department had written to express their dismay at what had happened and their solidarity with the Wilsons. They're calling it a watershed moment, Victoria explained. Many are saying this has opened their eyes to biases they didn't realize existed in our company culture. James passed the tablet to Margaret, who read through the messages with tears in her eyes. You see, she said to James, this is why your work matters. This is why you can't step away. Victoria nodded in agreement. The board is unanimous in their support, Mr. Wilson. Even Peterson called to say he now understands why the diversity training is so essential. James shook his head in disbelief. It took my pregnant wife being profiled and humiliated for them to get it. Sometimes, Margaret said gently, that's what it takes, a personal connection to make the abstract concrete. You've been telling them for years why this matters. Now they've seen it firsthand through someone they know and respect. Victoria's phone buzzed with a text. She checked it and looked up with surprise. Sir, Diane Mercer is in the hospital lobby. She's asking if she could speak with you and Dr. Wilson. James and Margaret exchanged glances. It's your call, James said to his wife. You're the one who was mistreated. Margaret considered for a moment, then nodded. I'll see her. Victoria texted back, then excused herself to wait in the hallway. A few minutes later, there was another knock at the door. Diane Mercer entered hesitantly, looking much smaller and older than she had on the plane. Her perfect blonde coiffure was slightly disheveled, and her eyes were red-rimmed from crying. Mr. Wilson, Dr. Wilson, she began, her voice barely above a whisper. Thank you for seeing me. I wanted to apologize in person for my inexcusable behavior today. James gestured to a chair. Please sit down, Diane. Diane perched on the edge of the chair, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. I've been with the airline for 32 years. I thought I knew what good service meant. I thought I treated all our passengers with respect. She paused, struggling to maintain her composure. Today showed me how wrong I was. Why did you assume I didn't belong in first class? Margaret asked directly. Diane flinched at the question but forced herself to meet Margaret's gaze. I've been asking myself that same question all afternoon. The honest answer is I made assumptions based on how you look, and that's... She swallowed hard. That's racism, plain and simple. I didn't think I was capable of that, but I was wrong. The admission hung in the air between them, raw and uncomfortable, but undeniably true. Thank you for that honesty, Margaret said finally. It can't have been easy to say. It's the least I can do, Diane replied. I know I've been placed on administrative leave, and I accept whatever consequences come next. But I wanted you both to know how deeply sorry I am, not just for today, but for any other passengers I may have treated unfairly without even realizing it. James leaned forward. Diane, you've been with the airline longer than almost anyone. You've seen it change and grow over 3 decades. What happened today, it's not just about you. It's about a culture that needs to change. I understand that now, Diane said, and I want to help change it if you'll let me. James raised his eyebrows in surprise. What do you mean? Instead of firing me, Diane suggested, use me as an example. Let me be part of your diversity training program, a case study in how unconscious bias can affect even those of us who think we're fair and professional. Margaret and James exchanged surprised glances. You'd be willing to do that? Margaret asked. To talk openly about what happened today? Diane nodded firmly. Yes, if my experience can help prevent this from happening to someone else, then at least some good will have come from my mistake. James considered the proposal, stroking his chin thoughtfully. It's an interesting idea, but I'd need to discuss it with HR and the training team. And I'd want to be involved in that conversation, Margaret added. If we're going to use this as a teaching moment, it needs to be done right. Diane looked from James to Margaret, hope dawning on her face. Does that mean you're considering it? You'd give me a chance to make amends? We'll consider it, James confirmed. But regardless of what happens with your employment, Diane, the real question is, what will you do differently going forward? How will you change your perspective and your actions? Diane took a deep breath. I've already started. On my way here, I called my son. His wife is black, and they have 2 beautiful children, my grandchildren. I've always claimed to be colorblind with them, to not see race. Today made me realize that's not enough. Not seeing is part of the problem. I need to actually see, acknowledge, and understand their experiences in a way I've been avoiding. Margaret nodded in approval. That's a good start. A nurse entered to check Margaret's vitals, politely indicating that their visitor should leave soon. Diane stood to go. Thank you both for hearing me out. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I'm grateful for the chance to apologize. As Diane reached the door, Margaret called after her. Diane! The flight attendant turned back. We all have blind spots, Margaret said gently. The question is what we do when they're exposed. Remember that conversation with your son and grandchildren? That's where real change begins. Diane nodded, tears in her eyes, and quietly left the room. After the nurse completed her checks and departed, James moved to sit on the edge of Margaret's bed. You never cease to amaze me with your capacity for compassion, he said, taking her hand. Margaret shrugged. It's not about forgiveness. It's about transformation. If Diane genuinely wants to change, who are we to stand in the way of that growth? You know, James said thoughtfully, her suggestion about being part of the training program is actually brilliant. It would be much more powerful to have someone from within the company acknowledge their biases and share their journey toward awareness. A personal testimony rather than an abstract concept, Margaret agreed. It could be exactly what your program needs to really connect with employees. James nodded slowly. I'll talk to the training team tomorrow. If they agree, we could develop a whole new approach, one that centers on real experiences and personal growth rather than just policies and procedures. Now that, Margaret said with a smile, sounds like a silver lining I can embrace. The monitor tracking their baby's heartbeat continued its reassuring rhythm, a steady reminder of the future they were working to improve, not just for their daughter, but for everyone who deserved to be seen, respected, and welcomed without question. 6 months later, the auditorium at the Airline's training center was filled to capacity, with nearly 300 employees gathered for the inaugural session of the new Diversity and Inclusion program. The buzz of conversation filled the room as people settled into their seats, many curious about the revamped training they had heard so much about. At exactly 9 o'clock, James Wilson walked onto the stage, his presence immediately commanding attention. The room fell silent as he approached the podium. Good morning, he began, his deep voice carrying throughout the space without the need for much amplification. Thank you all for being here today. What we're about to launch is not just another corporate initiative or box-checking exercise. It's a fundamental shift in how we see ourselves, our colleagues, and the passengers we serve. He paused, looking out at the sea of faces: pilots, flight attendants, gate agents, mechanics, office staff, the diverse workforce that kept the airline running day and night. Many of you have heard about an incident that occurred on one of our flights 6 months ago, James continued. My pregnant wife, Dr. Margaret Wilson, was profiled and challenged about her right to be in first class by one of our most experienced flight attendants. A murmur ran through the audience. The story had indeed circulated widely, becoming something of a legend within the company. What could have been simply a PR disaster or a legal liability became something else entirely, James said. It became an opportunity for growth and transformation, not just for the individuals involved, but for our entire organization. He gestured to the side of the stage. I'd like to introduce you to the woman who helped make that transformation possible. Please welcome Diane Mercer. Diane walked onto the stage to surprised applause. Gone was the perfectly coiffed flight attendant from 6 months ago. In her place stood a woman who appeared more genuine, more humble, her hair now its natural gray, her smile tentative but authentic. Good morning, Diane said, standing beside James at the podium. 6 months ago, I made a mistake that I'm deeply ashamed of. I judged a passenger based solely on her appearance and treated her in a way that was disrespectful and hurtful. She took a steadying breath before continuing. I've been with this airline for almost 33 years. I've always prided myself on providing excellent service, but what I didn't realize was that my definition of excellent was colored by biases I didn't even know I had. The room was completely silent now, every person present hanging on Diane's words. When I realized that the woman I had dismissed and disrespected was our CEO's wife, Diane continued, I was mortified, but the real shame came later when I finally understood that it shouldn't have mattered who she was. Every passenger, every person, deserves the same respect and courtesy, regardless of their appearance or position. James placed a supportive hand on Diane's shoulder. Thank you, Diane. Your honesty and willingness to share your experience are the foundation of our new approach to diversity and inclusion. He turned back to the audience. You'll notice we're calling this program Mirrors and Windows. It's designed to help us see ourselves clearly, the biases and assumptions we may not even realize we hold, and also to look outward, to see and truly understand the experiences of others. A slide appeared on the screen behind them, showing the faces of diverse passengers and employees, including a pregnant black woman who looked remarkably like Margaret. Now, James said, I'd like to introduce someone who has been instrumental in developing this program, someone whose perspective as both a medical professional and a person who has experienced bias firsthand has been invaluable. Please welcome Dr. Margaret Wilson. The audience applauded as Margaret walked onto the stage, their baby daughter Alois cradled in her arms. At 6 weeks old, Alois was alert and curious, her dark eyes wide as she took in the lights and sounds of the auditorium. Thank you all for being here, Margaret began, shifting Alois to a more comfortable position. When I agreed to help develop this program, I had 2 goals in mind. First, to create something that would lead to meaningful, lasting change in how people see and treat one another. And second, to help build a world where my daughter and all children can move through life without being judged by the color of their skin. She looked down at Alois with a tender smile. This little one hasn't experienced discrimination yet. She doesn't know that some people might look at her and make assumptions about who she is or what she's capable of. But one day she will. And what gives me hope is knowing that through programs like this, through honest conversations and real commitment to change, we can create a future where those experiences become increasingly rare. Margaret turned to Diane, who was watching Alois with a soft expression. Diane, would you like to hold her? Diane looked startled, then deeply moved by the offer. Carefully, Margaret transferred Alois into Diane's arms. Hello, beautiful, Diane whispered to the baby. Looking up at the audience with tears in her eyes, she said, This is why what we're doing matters. This is who we're doing it for. The image was powerful, the flight attendant who had once profiled and dismissed a pregnant black woman now cradling that same woman's child with obvious love and care. James stepped forward again. Over the next 2 days, you'll participate in a series of workshops and discussions designed to open both mirrors and windows. You'll hear from colleagues who have experienced bias, and you'll have the opportunity to reflect on your own assumptions and behaviors. He gestured to a diverse panel of employees now joining them on stage. These are your colleagues who have volunteered to share their stories. Some are painful, some are enlightening, all are real. And all will help us become the airline we aspire to be, one where everyone truly belongs. As the training session began in earnest, James stepped to the side of the stage where Margaret now stood, having reclaimed Alois from Diane. Look at what you started, James said quietly, putting his arm around his wife and daughter. Margaret smiled. What we started, together. They watched as Diane joined the panel of employees, her nervous energy giving way to passionate conviction as she began to share her story. Around the room, faces reflected surprise, recognition, and the dawning of new understanding. Do you think it will really change things? Margaret asked softly. James considered the question, watching as a young black flight attendant shared her experiences, then a Latino pilot, then a Muslim gate agent. He saw the nods of recognition, the uncomfortable shifts in posture as people confronted their own biases, the hands raised to ask questions or offer support. I think it already has, he replied finally. Not just for the airline, but for us too. He looked down at Alois, peacefully sleeping now in Margaret's arms, unaware of the legacy being built around her. 6 months ago, I was ready to step back to focus only on our family. I thought I had to choose between changing the world and being there for you and Alois. And now, Margaret prompted. Now I see that they're the same fight, James said. By being here, by doing this work, I am being there for you both, building the world she deserves to inherit. As the morning progressed, the conversation in the auditorium grew more animated, more honest, more transformative. Stories were shared, perspectives challenged, common ground discovered. It wasn't always comfortable, but it was always respectful, a true dialogue among people committed to growth and change. During a break, Diane approached Margaret and James, who were chatting with some of the panel members. I just wanted to thank you again, Diane said, not just for giving me a second chance, but for helping me see things I'd been blind to for decades. Margaret smiled. How are those conversations with your son and grandchildren going? Better every day, Diane replied. Last weekend, my grandson, he's 7, asked me why some kids at school said his skin was different. It was the first time I didn't just brush it off with people are all the same. We actually talked about it, really talked. And afterward, he hugged me and said, I'm glad you understand, Grandma. James nodded appreciatively. That's where real change happens, one conversation, one relationship at a time. As Diane rejoined the panel for the next session, Victoria Chen approached with a tablet in hand. "Sir, the early feedback scores from this morning's session are off the charts. Employees are rating it as the most impactful training they've ever attended." "That's encouraging," James said, "but the real measure of success will be what happens after they leave this room, how they treat each other and our passengers in the months and years to come." Victoria smiled. "Speaking of impact, you should see this." She handed him the tablet, open to an article in the aviation industry's leading publication. The headline read, "Wilson Airlines sets new standard for diversity and inclusion in aviation industry." The article detailed how the incident 6 months ago had sparked a transformation not just within James's airline, but across the industry, as other companies began to examine their own cultures and practices. "They're calling you a visionary," Victoria said, "for turning a potential PR crisis into an opportunity for industry-wide change." James handed the tablet back with a chuckle. "I'm no visionary. I just married one." He smiled at Margaret, who was introducing Alois to some of the younger employees. "She's the one who insisted we could use what happened to create something positive, something that would last." As the next session began, James and Margaret took seats at the back of the auditorium, Alois sleeping contentedly in her carrier between them. On stage, Diane and the other panel members were engaged in a candid discussion about recognizing and addressing microaggressions in the workplace. "You know," Margaret whispered to James, "6 months ago, I never would have imagined being here, watching Diane Mercer lead a conversation about racial bias." "People can surprise you," James replied, taking her hand. "Sometimes all they need is for someone to hold up a mirror and then offer them a window to something better." As they watched the session unfold, both could see that something profound was happening in that room, a genuine shift in understanding, a collective commitment to change. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't complete, but it was a beginning. And sometimes beginnings are everything. Thank you for listening. If this story touched you, please subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments.